Hello, everyone. This is Kristen Huber, and on behalf of 451 Research, I would like to welcome you and say thanks for attending today's webcast titled Cloudify Your Mobile Network, Transitioning to Open RAN for Established MNOs. Today's interactive discussion will be moderated by Eric Hanselman, who is Chief Analyst at 451 Research. Eric coordinates industry analysis across a broad portfolio of disciplines and is a member of 451 Research's Center of Excellence for Quantum Technologies. I have a few housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen and we'll get to as many as we can. The presentation slides are loaded in the resources section on your screen and ready for download. And finally, please check back for the on-demand version of this webcast after the conclusion of the live event. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Kristen. And thank you for joining us today. We've got a great panel of specialists across the RAN spectrum to really explore what are a set of new possibilities that are hitting the market with ideas around opening up radio networks and helping operators to get towards next stage capabilities. What we're going to be talking about on the webinar today are ideas around Open RAN, some of the opportunities that exist for operators, and the real meat of this is actually getting into a panel discussion, tackling a whole set of the questions that arise around transitions to Open RAN for existing networks. We're really going to be targeting this discussion at operators who are looking at being able to move from their current environments into more open footings and exploring what the opportunities are for them, what those paths forward are, and what are the chances in terms of moving forward that they can capitalize on what are a set of interesting opportunities. The opportunities for operators are expanding dramatically. We've seen a lot happening in the market in terms of capabilities that are out there. A lot of the discussions, though, have centered around greenfield opportunities. Our focus today is to really look at operators who have existing estates and what they can do to manage this transition, because there are a set of factors that have come into play that we think are particularly important in terms of what this transition looks like. There are new options for operators, including a maturing of the open ecosystems for RAN environments that are offering a whole set of new opportunities. There's flexibility in RAN that hasn't been previously available, that now can capitalize on virtualization. A lot of the things that we've seen in telco environments in terms of virtualizing functions, and that are now focused on RAN capabilities. Supporting all of this are a set of more powerful operating system platforms that can deliver the capabilities that are necessary to support virtualization of RAN functions, and a lot of the capabilities that are necessary to move towards open environments. The requirements for operators are clear. There are very strong motivations in terms of moving forward into this new market, not only maintaining competitive positioning, which of course is critical, but opportunities for innovation. Beginning to move traditional thinking about service delivery capabilities onto new footings, to be able to look at additional value opportunities in terms of what you can actually do with your environments and your networks, and the capabilities in terms of how you actually monetize them, and the capabilities you can bring to your subscribers in terms of what they fit. Part of this is enhancing agility, the speed with which you can deliver capabilities and new services, and also efficiency in terms of making your environments run more effectively, to be able to manage costs as we look at the densification of 4G networks and looking towards transitions to 5G. All of these are a set of motivations for operators that should be catalyzing action. And what we're going to be talking about today are what some of those motivations are. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists today. I'll be commenting on a lot of these capabilities. First, we have Andres Silvos, networking consultant for Altiostar. Roma Iontel, who's principal telco architect for Red Hat. Daniel Lynch, who's the FlexRAN business director for Intel. And Umberto LaRoche, who's principal engineer for service provider networks from Cisco. Welcome to you all, and I want to kick off the discussion with an opening question about the open ecosystem and what's happening in the world of RAN, and where are we in terms of this development. So to kick things off, what are your thoughts about what's changing in the approaches to telecom technology in general, and how is this affecting thoughts about Open RAN? And I'll open that up to whoever wants to jump in first.
Hey, this is Dan here. From Intel, so we kicked it off. I think, like us all, we probably speak best when we reflect on personal experiences. And when I joined Intel, and 4G was being prepared, and there was real utter confusion when most people realized that data traffic was the prime use case for 4G. Sure, that the Apple phone effect had filtered into the industry, and mobile data was kicking off. But what about voice? You know, why isn't voice getting mindshare for 4G? So I see the similar kind of parallels in 5G, where you're shifting away from a pure data play to value-added services. This clearly was attempted in the 4G timeframe with FTMEC, but you know, the simple matter of fact is that the wide-scale adoption of edge services couldn't differentiate itself versus a hosted cloud service for 4G. Now, the very nature of 5G, the latency, the high throughput requirements, will really kind of result in a significant boost to that equation of the value of the service being hosted at the edge versus highly centralized. So for me, I think the big thing happening in the telecom industry is that shift 5G moving from data only to services and services at the edge. And really, I think the industry is still struggling to wrap its head around that.
Well, I think for many operators, this is a transition that actually has to influence some very fundamental thinking about how they're approaching the market. It's especially when you start thinking about open approaches. These are a different set of considerations. Are these areas that, if we start thinking about what those new service models are, that operators should be looking in specific areas in terms of particular types of services? And Dan, you were mentioning this transition from thinking about data transit only. I mean, there are a lot of service capabilities that can be layered on top of this.
Well, I would say that service providers have been looking at the success the IT industry has been having with their transitions and trying to duplicate that and in their networks with the new technologies in adapting open source software, new ways of working, you know, like DevOps, continuous integration, continuous deployment, different approach to how you operate your network, and different approach to just internal processes and how you interact with your customers. And that's all affecting the thinking of what the network is going to look like in the future.
Well, and you raise an interesting point. I think if we look at what's been happening, certainly on one side of the operator business in general, you know, things like NFV, virtualization, have started to move forward. I mean, virtualization, of course, has done significant work to transform the IT world. And I think that's an important parallel that operators should be considering. Virtualization is now starting to get into areas where I think originally there was a lot of skepticism as to whether or not RAN virtualization itself was really even possible. But I think now we're getting to a point at which there are mature capabilities. If you think about what this transition is, virtualization in the RAN is definitely here today. Is that a safe statement to make?
Oh, absolutely. We've seen it all over. We see those deployments in all our major customers, tier 1s, and trickling down to tier 2, tier 3. So that revolution already happened. And, you know, we have some stragglers who are just catching up. But in that transition, many of the operators also discovered that some of the benefits they were looking for are not necessarily materializing as fast as they were expecting, or not materializing at all because they still have the legacy networks interworking with their new transition networks. And they basically have to run two organizations, two different operations potentially in parallel, right? So some of the cost benefits are not there. So now they're looking on how to bridge that gap, how to make it, the whole virtualization cheaper, faster, easier.
So what should operators be considering when they're looking at virtualization? How can they avoid that? I'm curious, Andre, do you have perspectives on what that transition looks like, and when operators are starting to move into a more virtualized environment, what should they be considering?
Well, normally we recommend for brownfield operators, I think the first point would be to identify an entry point, or what would be a specific service element or an area that would be a first step in starting the journey into virtualization. So for greenfield operators, it's more evident. So you're deploying new infrastructure, whereas for brownfield, that can be a new element or a new region or a new technology. Then on top of that, it's important to build the ecosystem. So most operators today are familiarized with the concept of core virtualization. IT functions have been virtualized. So as they look into the RAN, they can potentially build upon that knowledge and other areas within the organization that have already explored those possibilities.
So is this an area where operator thinking needs to change? And how does openness play a role? I'm curious for the team. Oh, go ahead.
As a company that's based on the whole open concept, right, from our conception, Red Hat sees that struggle and that question being asked by our customers. How is open going to affect our business and transform it? And the question is, it opens a whole new horizons, right? It gives you an opportunity to completely rethink the way you build the networks. Instead of following your traditional vendors, you have a chance to innovate in a whole new way. And at the same time, it makes you more agile and potentially, if you do it right, and it makes you closer to the community, so you can pick up new things a lot faster versus, waiting for your standard bodies to come up with a set of requirements and standards that then have to trickle through all your vendors and then into your network. Open basically allows you to be active participant in this process a lot more, in my opinion.
Well, and I think if you see for the set of vendors that we've assembled for the panel today, we're starting to build out environments in RAN that have a whole set of potential choices in terms of what is a much richer vendor assortment to work with. I think for most operators, they're used to focusing on single vendors, especially in the area of RAN, to be able to manage that chunk of their environment. And I think for some, that shift in terms of moving towards multiple vendor relationships is one of those areas where it's opening some fairly significant new doors. It's also an area where there's some opportunities to open up to a whole set of new potential possibilities in terms of moving that forward. I'd be curious.
I'm sure Andre could speak to it a lot more, but I just have to say that it also lets our customers change their mind a lot quicker, right, about who they work with. It's a lot easier to change a piece of software than rip out hardware appliance from your network.
Well, that's one of the great benefits of virtualization, right?
Yeah, it sure is. And for me, when we're looking at we build our FlexRAN software releases, we do this on a quarterly basis. And what we're seeing is in the last 12, 18 months, a huge uptick on number of companies licensing that source code. So we give them the source code free of charge. We're now up to 80. So, what would have been traditionally a very small supply chain into this market, for us, we see 80 companies who are downloading our RAN software to help them build product. But it's very, very diverse now. The options at every level, from the hardware to NFVI to the software to the services, the connectivity to the radio heads, the overall infrastructure, the system integrator. There's so many options, and that's one of the areas that the operators are really upskilling, appreciating that everything from early deal negotiation, they're done differently. Different companies there's more in terms of conditions and more contracts there, and they're wrapping up their internal teams to understand how to deploy and manage this new RAN. So, they realize all these new benefits that an open RAN can bring to the table. There's a realization within the operating community that they have to ramp up their skills and their teams to be able to turn those on.
Well, they're now playing in a much more open ecosystem.
Exactly.
Perhaps one thing that should be said, Eric, is the connection with the business outcomes that this transition to an open virtualized radio access network will bring about. Let's not forget some of the key fundamentals about 5G and about some of the transformations that we're anticipating in connection with the business models that operators will develop moving forward. I think one of the key elements is that rather than an operator to consumer offer, 5G is basically a technology that is geared to support business to business and also business to consumer type offers. So from an operator perspective, if the desired business outcome is to develop revenue opportunities associated to business to B, then they must build the network that supports that kind of capability. That network is an automated, open, virtualized, cloud-based type infrastructure end-to-end. I think the consensus is there, and that has been broadly appreciated by the industry. Certainly by the operators that we speak to. There are, of course, additional benefits that some of my colleagues on this call have touched on, but at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is a different way of monetizing and realizing the value of the network that can only be captured with an open, virtualized, cloud-based infrastructure.
Well, you raise a really interesting point in that business focus, that if these are going to be business-to-business oriented services, it does have to be an environment in which you've got the flexibility to adapt to whatever those business-focused opportunities are that you're firing on. And I think to Daniel's point, the fact that you now have this much broader set of vendors who are participating, it's now possible for operators to be able to select the capabilities that they need to address a particular opportunity much more specifically if their environments are open enough to be able to bring in this whole set of new innovations that can allow them to actually reach this potential. That's an area, I think, that has tremendous possibilities.
Yes, and if I may chime in once more, one of the main comments that we keep getting from the operators that we speak with is that their mobile supply chain, particularly for the RAN, is broken. It's not working the way that they expect. And that in order to improve the supply chain economics, they need to introduce more vendor diversity into the RAN. Now, this is a clear objective. This doesn't come about because, people think that virtualization in and out of itself is a good thing. They've come to that conclusion because there is a specific business outcome associated to the benefits of having more diversity within the radio access network supply chain. And that's another point that has to be well understood in connection with what's driving these trends moving forward. And I think as some of my colleagues have emphasized before when they use the term ecosystem, at Cisco, we agree that building an ecosystem is an all-important factor. You gotta have the ecosystem in place with the set of vendors that can provide value into that ecosystem. And I'd say, just to put it very bluntly, that the days of a single vendor coming in and saying, don't worry, I am the ecosystem, that's not enough. It has to be much broader than that. It has to include elements for all components as well as the all-important system integration type services and capability that ultimately ensure that the network works the way it should.
And we've been in an environment in which, frankly, there's been consolidation of that vendor ecosystem over time. But now we've got an opportunity to be able to open that up very significantly. But I think, Umberto, to your point, it does require operators to think, actively move towards expanding what that ecosystem looks like. One of the things that we see as an important part of that is looking at their procurement paths. And that's, you're sort of the 101 of this first stage of actually getting there, is starting to think about actually expanding what that view is of the opportunities that are out there. There are RFP requirements. There are all sorts of other pieces that are there. I'd be curious to get each of your comments on what that front-end piece is that operators have to look at to really expand these capabilities, and more importantly, to encourage openness.
Yeah, I think there's I think some of the big operators have really taken a leadership position for the entire industry. You really got, I think Rakuten, what happened there really signaled an intent to the market, that the viability statement to the market. But and then we follow up with the recent TIP Congress with Telefonica and Vodafone in terms of their very bold statements, but very practical, pragmatic approaches to it as well. Very much saying, listen, the trials we have, if you look at the KPIs, they're not 100% awesome, but they're trending all in the right direction. So they have this, like Umberto said, the strategy allows them to look at what they're seeing right now, and you can see the vision. And then they're really identifying those key opcodes that can first deploy Open RAN and really making that happen. And then just even practical things like, okay, so that's the solution right now. Understanding that the software, the hardware, everything will be optimized, because now you're into the kind of the Moore's law effect, both on the silicon and the software, which will improve the Open RAN solutions, both the connectivity and the services. So those, and then you couple in the likes of Verizon, Telia, Orange. They're the leading lights here in the industry, showing that the rest of the operators what can be done, how to go about doing it. And then you could also see that the operator community are having those discussions at the various different events like TIP, like ORAN, and sharing their knowledge, sharing the lessons learned from simple things like, going on to a hardware website and purchasing one system and putting that one system price into their TCO analysis. And so, actually, that's not the right way of doing it. Simple things like that. Just this is what I learned, and then feeding that into the other operators. Yeah.
Well, and it seems like we're now in an environment in which there is enough active discussion about the capabilities. There are a whole set of both operator environments and communities that can start to foster some of this education. There are a whole set of things that we can start to look at in terms of having information that's out there. But it is a set of things that operators need to start thinking a little differently about. When we start looking at virtualization, I think maybe there's some useful parallels that we can draw along the IT journey to be able to get to there. I'd toss out one: operators need to start thinking about infrastructure sizing. When they had RAN environments they were purchasing from a single vendor, that was pretty straightforward, in that you were getting all of that sizing capability directly from your one vendor of that gear. As we start to move to virtualization, there are a set of new things they should be looking after. What are some of these steps, and what are some of the pieces that, as operators start to really get more into the virtualization of their RAN capabilities and looking at openness, that they should start to address? Are there other things they should look at in this journey? And what are those first few steps, and what could be some valuable steps they take to move forward?
So, Eric, regarding sizing and scale, I think the operators really need to be flexible and adapt. And one of the great benefits that virtualization brings is, would be the ability to have a more granular deployment and support physical systems that can be closer to where they're needed, which would be the edge of the network, and mobile network that would naturally be the RAN. Virtualization will allow the operators to have a better utilization for the resources consumption, and reducing the size and the power demands that are required at the RAN to provide to the end users. So operators can really benefit by examining and start deploying in smaller increments of compute and storage to take advantage of these benefits. And as they start to realize the enhanced user experience and all the flexibility they can get both from Open RAN and virtualization, that's when I think that the environment would be ready for full-scale deployment.
So it sounds like that's one way that... Oh, no, go ahead, Rima.
Yeah, I was going to add something. There's a lot more flexibility now where you put your workloads, right? Basically your services, including VRAN, because now you're not locked into your own central offices or even your data centers. You can go to the edge, as was just mentioned, but you can also go into public clouds, right? Those are so widespread. Even if you don't have your own infrastructure there, you can take advantage of something that somebody else already put in there and just burst into it if you need to, because your actual service, your actual solution is virtualized and can potentially run on somebody else's infrastructure.
Yeah, and it's particularly true if you're decomposing your what had been those monolithic chunks of RAN capacity. Now you start to be able to put those workloads where they're most appropriately run, where you can manage them at scale, and where most efficiently they can be put to work.
And
yeah, absolutely. Especially, sorry, go ahead.
I was simply going to emphasize that gives you an example of the kind of business outcome that you expect out of the evolution to 5G. With decomposition of the radio, with decomposition of the mobile core, what you have is the emergence of this edge in between. And that edge location, manifestly poorly defined concept, let's be clear about it, an edge is workload dependent. It's not a specific point of the network. Yes, we all agree with that. But that quote-unquote edge does provide you, as an operator, with the ability to support low latency and data reduction type of capabilities that can represent value to a potential business customer, such as, for example, a public cloud operator, who can in turn resell that service to their enterprise customers. So now you're talking about an ecosystem approach that you did not have before, where you've integrated enterprise, public cloud, mobile operator, and endpoints into a complete infrastructure that delivers better value, and that can only be accomplished through a thorough understanding of what the dynamics of cloud and virtualization entails. Whether it's through cloud bursting or through, generic multi-cloud concepts, you have that at your disposal when you embrace these principles of openness, decomposition, disaggregation, and emphasis on business-to-business opportunities as a way of getting to the end customer.
And it gets back to our... Oh, go ahead, Rim.
You also have to keep in mind, from the point of view of the operators, that this needs to be thought through before you start deploying, before you put everything in place, because you have to have all your systems keeping up with with the spread of your network, your OSS, BSS systems need to be engaged in it as well, right? You can't just put something in the public cloud and hope you can still charge for it adequately if you don't have the systems to keep track of what's happening in there, right? And you need to have a uniform underlying platform that you're running your workloads on, that you can manage in the same way and operate in the same way. Otherwise, the complexity is just going to kill you.
Well, that's another area that we should dive into. But I want to remind our audience, if you have any questions, please, there's a Q&A button on the On24 interface. Type in your questions there. We'll work to get to as many of them as we can. I see there are already some that are starting to trickle in. So please ask questions now, and we'll start to pick them up as we move forward. But Rima, you raised another interesting point around this, which is being able to operate at scale. I think most operators have gotten good at scale in a monoculture, but there are a whole set of new considerations when you start moving into operating at scale and the automation that's necessary. I think Daniel also mentioned the automation as part of this journey, as did Andre. This is one of those larger pieces that operators have to start getting their heads around, the idea that it's automation and capabilities that look at being able to project these components of this newer Open RAN into a whole set of different areas. And Bertha, you were touching on that as well.
Well, one of the considerations, I think, and since operators are so good at scaling, is in this new concept, we need to have the ability to deliver computational power and performance to meet the needs of RAN operations. So operators and even sometimes bound by regulatory mandates, they need to abide by a certain set of KPIs that are very stringent. So this is a requirement that will go beyond the simple need for basic virtualization infrastructure and moving functions closer to the edge. This, to deliver this very predictable response, virtualization platforms are required to provide very low jitter, low latency data handling, and control mechanisms to prioritize the delivery of resources and performance. That would be what's being called in the industry as an orchestration platform.
And a way to be able to ensure that those elements of functionality that need critical or have critical performance metrics get deployed to environments that can meet them. And I think that gets back to Rima's point about ensuring that you've got to make sure that you're building an environment that gives you the capabilities to manage that effectively.
And you know, there's an obvious question that arises, and that is whether or not the legacy OSS environment is even capable of handling the requirements of a new cloud-oriented, refocused infrastructure for an end-to-end mobile network that includes the radio as well. It seems to me that chances are that it isn't, and that therefore figuring out a way to break with the legacy OSS and build an infrastructure consistent with what the new services require is probably a sound approach.
So what does that transition look like? I know we've kicked around ideas for things like patterns like cap and grow, take those existing environments, put a lid on where they are, and start to move into new environments. Are there pluses and minuses to that? And what are options for operators as to what that strategy is for making that move?
You know, if I can chime in, Eric, I see two very high-level approaches. And I'm just going to be very informal in terms of how to describe them. One approach for implementing a transition and evolution of the radio access network is, shall we call it, a cell sector by cell sector approach. In that approach, what you do is you take certain spectrum bands that are either new because they've just been allocated to the operator, or they are spectrum bands associated to, say, 3G services that need to be reformed into new radio or what have you. And then implement the transition on top of the old, making sure that the old interworks with the new. And, you know, the early 3GPP specs have been focused on that kind of approach by defining, for example, interworking between a G node B and an E node B through what is essentially an X2 reference point, by defining, you know, the option 3 non-standalone access that allows you to preserve the value of your existing EPC. Those approaches are, in my opinion, too just incremental and not, they don't go far enough, I don't think. I think perhaps a better approach to look at the evolution rather than a cell sector by cell sector type approach would be, let's look at it from a cell site by cell site perspective, where you know, we migrate an existing cell site to a Cloud RAN environment, look at the interworking, you know, across the radio access network, and then go off to the next cell site and basically introduce the software environment for cloud virtualization on a cell site by cell site basis, making sure, for example, that the OSS environment in the new environment is adapted to what it should be for the cloud. And I think that approach minimizes dependencies on interfaces that the existing RAN vendor controls, such as, for example, an X2, which often has proprietary AVPs, or other interfaces that may be related to front haul. For example, CIPRI interfaces into a remote radio head. And so it would be a clean way of decoupling the old from the new, I think. But I think the jury's still out on that, and I think that you know, each operator will have individual circumstances. I'll also point out that ORAN has invested significantly in defining open interfaces, and you know, perhaps the most important thing that any operator could do, irrespective of any plan, is just to insist, absolutely insist, on open interoperable interfaces that enable the kind of modularity that eventually allows them to get to vendor diversity.
Well, and that reinforces that point that if we're thinking about what this transition looks like, a lot of that has to start in the procurement process to ensure that vendors are, or that operators are keeping vendors focused on interoperability. And then making sure that they actually are moving this forward. So a lot of capabilities there. There's one more comment coming from the background. Was I cutting somebody off there?
If I may add to Umberto's and to your comment, Eric, and having coming from an operator myself, I think that what we come to the realization is most operators, they want to get started today. They want to maintain their competitive position. They want to benefit from Open RAN. But the greatest challenge can be it's taking the first step. So where do they start? And our response to that typically is that you know, significant transformation will be a long-term process. Cloudifying your network, one that perhaps can be seen as a continual journey, not a one-time event. So yeah, each operator has their own situation and their own place in the industry, and their own, they might be looking for a lower TCO, or might be looking for being seen or perceived as more innovative. So we can consult and advise differently based on those particular circumstances. But generally, as you have mentioned, getting vendors engaged and putting those open requirements into future processes and into future RFPs can be a good starting point to getting up to benefit from the advantages of Open RAN and virtualization.
Yeah,
I think it's critical to laying the groundwork.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, Eric. I think we're all singing from the same hymn sheet today. It's really about laying the baseline platform today for the future growth, the future opportunities for the network. On a kind of release 15, 5G, really, you're still looking at just data only. So the motivations that certainly I see in the operating community is really that more control over the supply chain. They do, like Alberto said, they do want a radio head from multiple vendors. They want a digital unit box from multiple vendors. They want NFI. They want different. In order to control their spend, and then not just control the spend, but also going. You see a lot of a bit of envy in some parts of the operator community where they're feeling like they're getting the hand-me-downs from the bigger operators, where the supply chain is optimizing on the big tier one operators, and they're kind of getting that's worked in that spot in say North America or China or wherever. That'll have to work for you in Italy or in Spain or wherever. So it's getting not just higher supply chain management. It's also building their own roadmap. And like we talked at the start, the early examples of the operators doing this with the supply chain of Cisco, Red Hat, and Altiostar here on the call, showing it absolutely possible, gives them confidence to do it. But really, I think we're all kind of excited about the impact of 3GPP Release 16, because I think that's where a real true Open RAN solution to allow to deploy edge services on top of functionality that requires Release 16. That's going to be the hotbed of innovation. But you'll miss that cycle if you don't invest now. You're going to miss that cycle. You will be in a potentially in a competitive disadvantage from your neighboring operator in whatever opcode you're operating. If you don't have an Open RAN solution, they do, and there's a hot new service based on Release 16, and they can deploy it. And I think that service may only last for a period of time, and that's the other. The value of an Open RAN, you're deploying a service really only when it's needed, not just the classic day-night type of mindset. Is just look at events, look at the impact that the Pokemon app had to the industry a couple of years ago. That was hot for a period of time. So be able to strike deploying service in the RAN to be able to deliver on whatever those next wave of services that Release 16 will bring to the market.
Well, and I think you raise a point that all of you panelists have been putting together, which is that this is something that is a journey that has to get started now, that operators have to be moving forward, that, again, Release 16, yeah, it's a future, it's coming down the road, but if, to your point, unless you're prepared and ready operationally, and I think more importantly, from a mindset perspective, it's something that you're going to be playing catch up. And it's going to be hard to maintain a competitive position when you get there, whether or not that's the latest mobile gaming innovations, new business service capabilities. It's a whole set of things we have to start thinking about, that operators have to start thinking about in new ways to be able to capitalize on this. I want to give our audience one more call for questions. We've got a handful here, so I want to step to Q&A. And some of these I think we've addressed in some form or fashion, but let me get them out there. The first one is, how can operational disruption be minimized? And I think that's something that echoes a lot of concerns that we hear from a lot of our clients, in that large environments are typically fairly resistant to change. I think we've talked about a number of different aspects of how that change moves forward. But any particular thoughts? I think Umberto had mentioned looking at full site transitions so that you can avoid any issues with proprietary interfaces that exist in the RAN today. Again, something that's going to continue to progress and mature as we go forward. But any other thoughts on that? Or
one of the examples we've seen. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Rima, please.
Yeah, one of the examples we've seen in our customers is creating basically a new operations team dedicated to this type of network, right? They still have their old operations dedicated to the legacy networks, but they start training some people, changing their mindset, right? Getting them used to new tools, new ways of thinking, new ways of operating, and slowly transitioning and building out that team as you turn off and you get rid of your legacy. So that's one of the approaches we've seen that sort of minimizes the disruption. You're not retraining your whole operations. You're not throwing out all the existing tools. You're just slowly migrating.
Well, it gets back to Umberto's point of looking at maybe single sites as opposed to migrating across new frequencies or particular sectors, actually looking at a site transition to move that forward. Because then operationally, you'd have a constrained environment to actually work that transformation within.
Yeah, except this is more, in my opinion, this is a little bit more per service or, per segment of the network, whatever it is you transitioned already. So if one of your services is now running virtualized or containerized, this is what your new team is focusing on, this new platform, these new services. And as more services are coming, onto the platform, more operations people dedicated to those services get pulled in and trained.
Yeah, that's a straightforward way of managing that. All right, our second question is dealing with multiple vendors, raising complexity. I think the short answer is yes, but it's also improving opportunity. Again, the panelists, thoughts on this? We've touched on a bunch of these different pieces about expanding your vendor ecosystem. And while there may be complexity, it seems like the opportunity is the factor that's outweighed here.
Yes, we did, and we must also reinforce the progress that has been made by the O-RAN Alliance. It has to be mentioned that it was formed not only by vendors, but mostly by operators themselves, and aimed at fostering the creation of open and interoperable interfaces and the definitions that allow the operators to deploy these independently developed functions across their networks. So vendors are very much interested in it as well. I can tell by some of the vendors we interact with that it is in their best interest to work with operators and adopting O-RAN to address the expanding set of needs and use cases requirements that come with 5G deployments. And that's actually an opportunity for them as well. We will extend their own product suites. Also, a little bit to the complexity, I can say that the keywords, at least to us here at Altiostar, would be certification and interoperability integration. That's what the software suite aims at doing to reduce the complexity to the operators and make sure that they have a seamless transition towards virtualized environments and Open RAN.
I just don't, when I see multiple vendors, guys, the complexity is not, it's very easy to see from the outside, but the reality is on the inside, when you're working on solutions like this, it's the opportunity that this brings. It's in the rooms, you've a more diverse set of people caring about problems and looking for opportunities. Different walks of life, different company cultures, and it's so much more. For me, it's highly innovative. When there's an issue, there's there's issues. Of course, there's issues with everything. and there's more companies that care about it and work together and collaborate and figure out how to solve those issues. And then challenges with deployment types or what kind of services, it's just more voices, more ideas, more critical mass looking at this. So all I see with more vendors is just more opportunity, much better for networks.
Well, and with more opportunity, you've got more choice, and that also reduces risk. So a whole set of different benefits there.
Yeah.
Certainly having a company.
Oh, Umberto, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I apologize. The platform has some delay in it, and I try to back off. Kind of like Ethernet exponential back off there, but it doesn't always work.
I was going to say, it's CSMACD, right?
Yeah. So it's sort of interesting in my mind. I can't imagine that, dealing with vendors is ever easy. I got to be honest. I've been on the vendor side most of my career. And we do our very best to make it easy to do business with. And now we're saying that, there's significant benefits associated to having more vendor diversity. I think it frankly boils down to, what does it mean for your business? What it means for your business is a better business case because you have the ability to manage your vendor ecosystem better. That results in lower CapEx. It also means faster time to innovation, which is the point that Daniel was making. It means that you can introduce features, functionalities quicker into the network than you were before. And it also means that you can manage your vendor ecosystem at an advantage because if you should happen to identify somebody who is not performing, then we're talking about a modular platform and architecture where you can just simply replace them. That's where I see the huge advantages. So yeah, is there work involved? I agree there's work involved, but contrast that to a mode of operation where you rely on a single vendor who promises to do everything right for you, but may not eventually deliver the goods. That's why in any other part of the network, you have far more vendor diversity because operators have understood that diversity is good for them. Yeah,
I have to agree with Umberto. Yeah, unlike Umberto, I've been on the operator side for most of my career until I moved to Red Hat. And having a diverse ecosystem takes commitment. You have to be actively involved in it, right? Working with the vendors, making sure they work with each other, making sure you meet all your interrupt testing needs, making sure you keep your vendor honest, quite frankly, when they claim they have open standard interfaces. Don't just believe them, test it, verify it, validate it. Make use of certification programs, create your own, utilize somebody else's, communicate your needs to your vendors, etc. And the rewards are actually great in that type of vibrant environment, as opposed to just having one vendor who can lock you in and basically dictate what type of services you can offer or what your network is going to look like.
Well, it seems like altogether a whole set of values that operators can capitalize on in terms of opening up their environments, enhancing choice, enhancing agility, opening the door to innovation, and reducing risk while they do that. So that was the last of our audience questions. Panelists, I want to thank you for all of the interesting perspectives today. Hopefully this has been educational for our audience. Again, all sorts of good things in terms of what we've discussed. And we'd like to look to our audience to continue this discussion. For each of the participants here, we've got a set of resources that are available both some research work that 451's been doing, individual perspectives from each of our vendors. These are all linked via the link on the webinar website, and we'll have some updates with additional material as well, so be sure to look back there for more information. With that, I want to thank you all and appreciate all the time that we spent together and the time that you spent with us. Thank you to all the panelists, and look forward to discussing the possibilities of Open RAN, cloudification, and transitions in the radio network with operators in the future. So thank you all.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.